Thank you very much, Anwen. I hope you can all hear me and see the presentation there. So I'd like to share with you some of the findings from our research project. This was a collaborative piece of work between myself and colleagues at Bangor University, colleagues led by Dr. Kath Jones at the University of South Wales, and colleagues led by Dr. Horda at Wrexham Glyndŵr University. So it was a collaborative piece. It was myself available today to speak to all, but I'm going to share findings from the whole setup. So if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to give you an understanding of the context and the rationale behind what we were doing. This stemmed from a piece of work which was already done by the same research team as a result of some funding available just almost before or just towards the end of the first lockdown period in the pandemic. Part of the Welsh Government's National Strategy for Educational Research and Inquiry. This was a collaborative project which looked at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns on the health and well-being of children, young people, educational professionals, and initial teacher education providers. So the rationale for the current study came from the recommendations from that. So it was something which was already in motion. That study is available, published by Welsh Government on Hub, and I will refer to it a few times in this presentation, but it's something that is well worth reading because it gives that foundation. We found that through that study, outdoor learning played an increased role both in and out of school in supporting physical and mental well-being. And there was a subsequent recommendation from that report that called for greater support for outdoor learning. So it was clear from the previous study that outdoor learning played a significant part in the health and well-being of children and young people during the pandemic, and it was therefore reasonable to suggest that it would continue to play a role. So this study sought to investigate the current state of play, what was out there, who was doing what, and what that development might be, in order to provide a baseline of data to think about what might need to be put in place to support practitioners delivering in this field. There's currently a gap in the evidence base to know how frequently schools engage in outdoor learning, what format that outdoor learning takes. So that means that despite that call for greater support, the subsequent opportunities for outdoor learning highlighted in Curriculum for Wales. The new Curriculum for Wales 2022 has specific outdoor learning mentioned through the humanities AOLE documentation. And the natural affordances of the access to outdoor spaces that many folk in Wales enjoy. You know, the fact that nobody in Wales lives more than 2 hours journey from a national park or an area of outstanding natural beauty. It would be very difficult to achieve those goals because it's hard to measure what we're going to see at the end of this. So to ensure equitable and high quality bilingual access to outdoor learning for every child and young person across Wales, we need a national strategic vision. And this needs to be informed by the current state of play with regards to provision. We don't have that information, and this piece of work set out to address that. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'll start right at the beginning with the findings. Findings can be towards the end, and I wanted to make sure we were very clear on this before we looked at some of the methodology. So the key findings here were that the most common aspects of outdoor learning sessions were play and personal and social development well-being. There's a strong tradition in the literature that supports this, and that was certainly borne out by what we saw. If we asked staff about curriculum links they were making directly from their outdoor learning sessions, the most common links were with health and well-being and with language literacy and communication. In fact, they were dominant by quite a significant way. Interesting to see the language literacy communication. As I say, the literature base tells us about the health and well-being benefits, but actually seeing practitioners use the outdoors for language literacy and communication was quite interesting. It was very clear from the schools that responded that the four purposes were really underpinning the majority of the planned sessions, and actually many school partners saw those as outdoor learning as a way they could really demonstrate they were delivering on those four purposes. Few of the sessions that were delivered actually utilised a planned or recognised award scheme, things like the John Muir Award, Eco Schools. There are a number of those sorts of schemes out there. The new adventure learning framework from Dulliau'r agored, then they weren't utilised very much at all. So actually what schools were doing was something that was they'd created themselves. Not much report on forest schools either, which was a somewhat surprise compared to some things in the literature, but that also may be representing by the schools we spoke to, which I'll come to when I talk about the limitations of the study shortly. The choice, the way children chose and the challenge they experienced were the areas which teachers reported were the areas of greatest development among children and young people through doing outdoor learning activities. So building, actually, from what we've heard from our colleagues in the previous study, that opportunity for children and young people to take ownership of their learning and decide where they were going to go was certainly a significant part of that. If we go to the next slide, we can consider the research design that was utilised in this particular project. Now, what this project did was utilised a methodology and an instrument that had been demonstrated as effective by a team from the University of Stirling in Scotland through some commissioned work by Scottish Government in 2006, 2015, and then subsequently a little bit later in 2018, although the 2018 report is still in publication. This was led by Greg Mannion from Stirling, and that was the actual title of that piece was Teaching, Learning and Play in the Outdoors, a survey of school and preschool provision in Scotland. It used an approach that's been proven to be effective, and it was something that was able to be administered longitudinally, and that's something we were very keen to start to set out within Wales, to actually start to have that baseline data and see how that develops over time. So it has resulted in quite a considerable data set for the colleagues in Scotland, and again, as I say, we were really concerned or keen that might be the case within Wales. So we spoke to the team from Scotland, we spoke to the folks in Stirling. They gave us permission to utilise and adapt their instrument and actually talk through some of the challenges they faced. So our research has utilised that approach with the teacher at the centre of the data collection. Data was collected through an online survey, which was analysed afterwards, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Largely, we used a convenience sample. The speed we needed to do the work in, and the already established or the pre-existing connections through all of us being ITE providers was quite a useful way of actually accessing schools and utilising those, which we'd worked with in the past as well. And as I say, even many of the research team are directly involved in ITE, so have those direct personal relationships with head teachers, principals, and leaders of learning in those particular schools. The range of schools, we covered primary schools, secondary schools, and some special schools, and a couple of independent schools as well. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. We also were keen to try to target schools across the economic diversity. So we looked at schools, we specifically looked to try and work with schools in the 10% most deprived, according to the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivations, the 10 to 20% and the 20 to 30%, as well as the others. And we also were keen to cover a difference in rural and urban classification, which we used the rural urban classification from 2011 to try to have some representation from each of those. Again, looking at particular patterns, looking at areas where the colleagues in Scotland had found there were gaps and they didn't have classification for that sort of data, and to try to make this as representative as possible. Obviously, we went through ethical approval, and that was quite a useful process because we were able to do that through the three universities working together, with one ethics committee agreeing this and actually the others taking their letter of approval as something which they accepted. One of the key challenges was to adapt the survey for the Welsh context. Obviously, colleagues who are aware of what's going on in Scotland, the curriculum for excellence has been around since 2010, but there are differences. There are cultural differences. There are contextual differences. So one of our first tasks was to adapt and update the survey instrument, which we did in line with Curriculum for Wales 2022. One of the biggest changes was that the Scots first of all started using a paper-based survey. Now, bear in mind, they started in 2006. The world had moved on significantly, not least because of the interaction and reliance on technology through COVID. So we opted for an online survey. Now, one of the things I'm going to discuss later was that maybe that might have been a good idea. Maybe that might not have been quite as effective as the team in Scotland found. So the other thing that was a major difference between what we were able to do was that the team in Scotland looked at outdoor learning that happened in May and June. The way that this particular project was funded meant we had to do the survey work a little bit earlier in the year. So we were already aware that potentially the different weather we experience in Wales in February and March might have impacted the results of the study. I'm sure if anybody has looked out the window in the last 24 hours, they've probably seen 4 different seasons, and that is certainly the case that we experienced in the survey. If we move on to the next slide, which talks about the challenges. So as I say, this was our biggest one, and it is the elephant in the room when you read the report. that a convenient sample was used, and we had looked at, I think our sample calculation was going to be around 91 schools at a 10% confidence interval. The difficulty was the very, very low uptake in the surveys. So we eventually gained 12 responses to our surveys, which is an incredibly low amount. If you compare that, interestingly, to the number of the schools in Scotland that responded, so we were dealing with 1,553 schools, something like that in Wales. We're dealing with about 0.6, 0.7% response. In Scotland, the team achieved just under 1% representation, although they still managed to maintain Scottish Government funding to run from 2006, 2015, and a third iteration of the study. So it would appear that initially, surveys on outdoor learning, however they run, are not always incredibly popular. So that's the first thing that we really take to learn from that. There's another issue here in that there is a lack of an agreed definition as to what outdoor learning actually is. A number of authors, Mewn, Waters, and a few folks from within Wales have offered those definitions, but they're not always easily accepted. There is, as Anwen highlighted, there is actually in the Foundation Phase Outdoor Learning Handbook, there is something from 2009 from Welsh Government, but it is very much focused around foundation phase, and it's very unlikely that secondary colleagues or even upper primary colleagues will actually look at that information to know where that stands. We've started to move forward with that. There is now a Senedd cross-party group that looks at the outdoor adventure sector, and that group was able to present some information to the Education Minister in September this year, and actually started to describe outdoor learning as a pedagogy and approach, which was distinct and different to adventure education as a subject, which is something which many people, particularly in the secondary sector, often see. They see kayaking, they see canoeing and gorge scrambling and those sorts of things, and they kind of conflate the two. So trying to tease those things apart was quite important, but there isn't that definition yet. The other challenge that we perceive, and we certainly see agreed with by the work of Maynard et al. In 2011, is that there is this perception that outdoor work is not real work, and that learning happens indoors. And that, that was something that they suggested as well. And we have this situation where learning in the outdoors, it's difficult to measure the impact. So are we in a position where we start to value just what we can measure, or do we go about designing ways of measuring what we actually value in curriculum? And that's a challenge. That's perhaps a bigger philosophical question. The literature review in the report contained a wide range of studies across England, Wales, and other countries. There was some linking to some ideas of the concept of friluftsliv, which is a Norwegian word meaning sort of outdoor living, a bit broader than that, or udeskola in Denmark. And those philosophies certainly impact in the forest school movement, which has been very successful in bringing a number of people who wouldn't normally perhaps deliver outdoor learning sessions. But it's also been quite restrictive in that sometimes school staff feel they have to have a forest school qualification at level 2 or level 3. And we're talking about many people who've got postgraduate qualifications here in pedagogy to deliver those sorts of activities. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. So if we can move on to the discussions, one of the points that was already I've brought about was the sample size, and one of the problems we faced there was a reticence on schools' behalf to complete negative returns. So we asked them to complete a survey every week over 8 weeks, but many schools, and I had this anecdotally when I visited student teachers, visited head teachers, said we've not done anything this week, so we haven't reported anything. And actually part of the data collection was trying to look at the patterns of when outdoor learning sessions were run. And it is that difficulty that many researchers will find, that it's very difficult to deal with negative data because people don't report it. So there's still a challenge in that way. The Scottish team had more success, but bearing in mind they were in their second or third iteration of the same study that they'd run over a period of 14 years. So there's a little bit more of an embedded sort of understanding of what was going on. This was our first time through. But even with that, we have to accept that we had a very low response rate, and therefore our sample can't be considered to be representative because we didn't have enough data. Perhaps it might be indicative of the schools we worked with, but again, we see that potentially it's the schools that do some outdoor learning that reported it. Other schools would not necessarily have engaged in the survey, and that is a challenge for taking this work forward. There is that question of, does real work actually happen outdoors? Is it something which we deal with, or are schools and head teachers concerned that when they are judged through their results, through their SDN inspections, etc., that stuff that happens outside will just be seen as play? Will it be seen as something which is not valuable? And I don't use that term derogatory, but some teachers, particularly as the children get older, secondary school in particular, they just concerned they haven't got that time. They're looking for outcomes. They're looking for cognitive outcomes, as opposed to perhaps the affective work that we do with our younger children, maybe in Methrin and Debin classes. And that's where we see more outdoor learning coming through. That was something that the previous study highlighted as well. There is a need for a working definition within the curriculum for Wales of what outdoor learning is. You know, what is it? It seems that it's going to be something which will be culturally relevant to Wales. It may not be the same as outdoor learning in the United States of America or Canada or Norway or Denmark, where this literature comes from. There's certainly some work from Heather Prince in Cumbria, who started to understand that there is a cultural dimension to outdoor learning. Learning in the outdoors is something which is unique, and the way it's done to each country where it happens. So that's something which we certainly have the opportunity. Within Wales, the curriculum for Wales, you'll all be familiar with this understanding of the term Cynefin, which is certainly becoming more popular within there. And actually, there is more recent literature coming from Welsh universities, from Welsh researchers, describing the idea of how Cynefin can be built into an understanding of place, how a place-responsive curriculum can actually be fostered through taking children outdoors and learning in the outdoors. So there is this need for this working definition, and then again within the curriculum for Wales, it's great to see those opportunities highlighted in the curriculum in the AOLE humanities, but again they're just bullet points. There perhaps needs to be a bit more guidance. If we look north of the border again, we look at the Scottish Government, who published Building Your Curriculum Inside, Outside and In, with the outside first, definitely the emphasis was on that, which was published by Scottish Government in 2020 as a series of guidelines that teachers might follow. We have a document, something like that, called High Quality Outdoor Learning for Wales, published by the Outdoor Education Advisors panel in 2021. And that certainly gives some guidance there, but perhaps we need some way to establish that. And finally, that then needs to have some professional learning opportunities for teachers. It's not part of ITE curricula at the moment. That was something that the previous study found, and it's not been taken into something that's as mandatory as an approach to pedagogy. So there may be trainee student teachers who get qualified, and actually they don't realise or know they may not even have an exposure to outdoor learning at all. So it becomes something which is a little bit odd, a little bit new. And again, this understanding: is it something that's real work? Is it an enrichment activity that actually just is great and builds on, but is a nice to have? Or is it an absolute core foundational pedagogical approach teachers can use for different learning about literacy and communication, learning about the expressive arts, all those aspects of curriculum that can be delivered outdoors? So the final slide is some recommendations, if we can click onto that, because we're running for it short of time, and I've seen there's some questions coming already. That realistically, we need to run this survey on a larger scale. We need to adapt the survey to be really definitely within the Welsh context, and potentially find the way to make that work in terms of the time frame, the time of year, the best approach in terms of the tool to use, whether online or paper survey or some hybrid of those might be there. There does need to be some updated guidelines to bridge, to go beyond foundation phase. It's great that foundation phase practitioners were able to do that, but to actually move that further up to the next 10 years of schooling is quite a challenge. Again, at the top end of things, at the top end age-wise, we've got qualifications now offered by Agored Cymru in the level 2 learning in the outdoors, level 3, which is going live this September. But that middle tranche, that middle band of children in Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, those early progression type stages from the ages of about 7 through to about 14, it's quite vague as to what they might do. Motivated teachers will look at those and actually adapt the curriculum, but there perhaps needs to be more guidance for those who don't have those skills. Professional learning communities, recommendation 6 there, the understanding that actually we need to build this into our school training, our teacher training. We've got some great voluntary provision in that, or voluntary in terms of school staff operating. Natural Resources Wales run outdoor learning networks in every county in North Wales. They employ for education officers who are a fantastic resource, but not every teacher knows about them. It's very much that the ones who know do, and the ones who don't know don't even know where to look. And that understanding of getting this resource or these resource base shared. And then potentially that final one there, collaborating to co-construct these sorts of lesson plans, approaches to assessment. They reaffirm the idea that real work, real learning can take place outdoors, so that it's possible for people to actually give value to what's being done in the outdoors. So again, as colleagues have already done, I'd urge you to read the report when it comes out, read the previous report. But thank you very much for your time. Happy to take the questions now.
Diolch o Garon, Graham am hynny. Thank you very much. Fel athrawes deifyddiaeth, mae'n un o pethau sydd yn cyffroi fi.
Geography teacher, one of the things that's what excited me.
Well, ydy heb os. So just quickly, Graham, before I go into the questions, as a geographer myself, or I should say these days, a humanities teacher. Without a doubt, I would argue every day that real learning does happen in the outdoors, and I would be a huge advocate. And of course, as you touched on it, there is the foundation learning phase, but we've got to remember that the qualifications Wales are increasing now for teaching in 2 years' time, a huge amount now on the non-examined assessment. So developing those skills from a young age, they're ready when they're in year 11 or year 13 for the non-examined elements, I would argue is exceptionally important. So diolch o galon. So you've actually hit for me a part that I really get excited about, and I would always take my pupils out. Okay, some of the questions. Quite a difficult one, the first one. What would you suggest would be a working definition of outdoor learning?
That's quite an interesting one. Whilst it might be, it appeared to be banana skin, I was privileged to be part of the team that presented to the Minister at the cross-party group. So I have nailed my colours to the mast on this one already. But in a nutshell, it is learning that takes place that values direct experience. It focuses predominantly around the interaction between the affective domain and the cognitive domain, with some psychomotor skills as well. It doesn't ignore the affective domain. It certainly takes place mainly outside, and is a pedagogical approach that can be used to deliver a wide range of learning outcomes. So it's a methodology rather than an outcome or a position itself. That would be where I'd start.
Diolch o galon, thank you very much. Next question. Does a school's environment prohibit frequent access to outdoor learning? Thinking of schools in inner cities with limited outdoor space in particular. And if I add a little spin to that, in a rural area, the cost of going to I know we've got some outdoor, but the cost of actually going to certain areas.
It doesn't. I think it could be one of those things that I bounce the question to other subject areas and say, does a school's environment prohibit from doing science if it hasn't got lots of science facilities? Does it prohibitions on physical education if it doesn't have a lot of sports facilities? I think the answer is that outdoor learning can be outdoors anywhere. And again, another project from Scotland, from colleagues in Ayrshire, actually looked at using tiny green spaces that may not even be green, that were being made green. So growing plants, growing vegetables in boxes, in concrete yards in the centre of, well, this was in Ayrshire, but they also replicated this study in the centre of Glasgow. Really sort of the stereotypical concrete jungle that you might imagine of sort of 1970s tower blocks, and schools in amongst that. So yes, it does. But also, that's where we need to support staff, is to give them those opportunities to be creative and to start those ideas. Something we're seeing with Curriculum for Wales already is that teachers are very, very creative people. When they get the opportunity to plan curriculum without some restrictions on them, they do plan amazing experiences for children. So there's an acceptance that outdoor learning is valuable and valid. I'm sure that our colleagues in school, with a little bit of guidance or support maybe in terms of health and safety, will be able to do a great job there. And again, Amit, you're right about the access, even for those in rural locations, if it's far away. I think we have to realise that actually outdoor learning can take place very close to home if necessary. So there's a great model, again, from Robbie Nichol and Pete Higgins in Scotland, where they've got a model which is circular. It looks like an archery target, where they start talking about outdoor learning happening just outside the classroom's door, then in the school grounds, then in the local park, and then maybe you might go to, Glanllyn or Grannog, or wherever you're going to go for a residential visit or a field studies visit to Dale Fort or Rydw Troia, whatever it might be.
Diolch o galon, and you did touch on it before in your presentation, pwysig with Cynefin, the importance of our Cynefin. So starting local, but understanding where we live on our very own doorstep. So we are 2 minutes. So I'm going to ask you a question. I don't even know if that's allowed as a chair. But if I just ask one question, do you think, though, a lot of people used to ask me, do you really take them out, 50 children into a river? Do you think that perhaps probably need the guidance and support, and if you would like, the guts to say, yes, it's okay for you to go, and as long as you've risk assessed it, you won't get into trouble, as long as you have thought of everything and taken everything into board? Because lots of teachers were gobsmacked but where I would take pupils, and nothing was dangerous, but that the fact that I would take 50 into a river, so do you think that guidance is really important?
I do, and I think we're very well supported in Wales with OEAP, the Outdoor Education Advisors Panel Cymru, Every local authority has access to one of those services. There's a network of them across the country, and they provide that sort of advice and training. I do that with my student teachers. I'm very fortunate to be a co-opted member of that group, and I'm able to give my student teachers the opportunity to gain their education visit leadership certification so that they're then able to do that themselves. One of the moves that we're working on with Welsh Government right now is to try to centralise those resources, perhaps make them available through Hub. Welsh Government already endorse and recommend the Outdoor Education Advisors Panel national guidance, which is available. We're working on actually translating that bilingually. It's a UK organisation, but we're translating and working that specifically. And that was very prevalent during the COVID times. And again, supporting what you've said, Anwen, actually some of the biggest, most common outdoor practitioners actually work in special schools. So again, we've got children with quite severe, complex behavioural and physical needs, and they're outdoors more than some of the other children, certainly in the locality where I live and the schools I work with in ITE partnership working. Some of those schools are outdoor more, and my student teachers find that difficult. They sort of go, hang on, why aren't mainstream children doing this? If this is so beneficial, why are they not doing it?
Diolch, Garon, and it's nice to see post-pandemic that we are out. There is a final question, and I will ask you to answer it in 1 minute, if that's okay. How much does teacher confidence matter in delivering effective outdoor learning? Do you think they always realise they're actually doing outdoor learning?
A lot, and yes. I do,
Yeah.
but I think they always recognise that other people value it. They might know that they're doing outdoor learning, but they almost feel they've got to justify it in some other way because actually outdoor learning itself is not real learning.
Diolch, Garon. Thank you very much for your work there, Graham, and for your answers. And as the others as well, don't go anywhere because we will ask you to come back later. Diolch yn fawr iawn. So diolch i chi.